Hello Kindred, Longevity Lifestyle Designers. This is Gavin here with secretsoflongevity.com. In behind me here is an amazing tree. It is often actually smaller than this. This is an extremely large specimen. It is the Saskatoon berry, A.K.A. Juneberry, A.K.A. wild pear, A.K.A. serviceberry, and it goes by half a dozen other names. Also the wild plum, chuckleberry, sugar plum, etc., etc. And it is a very edible, very tasty berry that has just come in season in my area. And as the name suggests, it usually comes into season around June. It is very loved by animals and people alike. It gets eaten pretty quickly by a lot of different birds and things, so I'm fortunate to find this specific tree so quickly before it's completely ravaged and left bare and devoid of its fruit. So I figured I could take the opportunity to show you guys what it looks like and give a bit more information about some of its traditional uses. One of the most widely used berries by the indigenous Americans in North America, and it was the traditional berry used in pemmican, which is something a lot of people have heard of, which is a combination of meat and berries, most often this berry, the serviceberry, but also blueberries are commonly used in that recipe, among a whole host of other berries that are edible and sweet that you would find in North America. So traditionally, it was prepared by cooking it. It's definitely not necessary to cook it. And as some of its other names suggest, it also has that distinct taste that I would describe as being quite similar to pear. It's got the consistency of a very ripe pear, even though it's a berry, it's tiny, but it's just as sweet. It does have a distinct difference in flavor as well, so it's not identical to a pear by any means, nor in the same family. The species name is Emelanchier, and there's a number of 20 or more subspecies, and they can also be crossbred. They range in size from being a small bush to being as large as this tree, which I'll stand back and show you the size of it in a moment, but it's about, I guess this might be a 10-foot tree. It goes quite high, so this might even be taller, but as far as I could see in my research is that the highest it gets is around 10 feet, so this location seems to get a lot of sun and has allowed this tree, which is obviously maybe a decade or more old, to get to the size it has. This looks like a smooth bark serviceberry, which I believe, as I get out my little guide here, would be the smooth serviceberry. That's the one that can get up to 10 meters tall. So it's actually not in feet, it's meters. So yeah, this one's definitely not 10 meters, so I was getting that mixed up in my head. So this size is actually totally appropriate for this species, and it could even probably get a little bit bigger. But still a very average sized tree. It's definitely not a massive tree, and it's not really a tree you can climb. So unless you have one on your property and can put out sheets every day, you're not going to be able to get the ones at the top necessarily unless you have a ladder. But there's definitely a lot of low-hanging branches where you can collect the berries quite easily. So aside from the obvious medicinal or health benefits that you'd get with your average berry, some of the other herbal benefits that can be used from the other portions of the plant would be the inner bark, the bark, and I've heard about the stems being used, and possibly the leaves, although I haven't specifically found information on that at this point. But the berries obviously are good for the eyes. That's common across virtually all berries because of the high anthocyanin and other antioxidant content that's found in them. And of course the vitamin C, which is rich in most fruits, is going to be great for immune health and everything that vitamin C is known to be good for. The other benefits of the components of the plant would be the inner bark, and bark is very specific to a lot of things pertaining to women's reproductive health. Some traditional preparations of the bark and things were used for helping the placenta after birth to be, birthed, if that's being held back for any reason after a woman's given birth. It's also good for overall reproductive health for women. It's also been used because it has slight contraceptive type properties to halt the menstrual cycle, essentially. So it's probably not something you would want to play around with without the guidance of a qualified herbalist, unless you're an herbalist and want to experiment with that for whatever reason. But probably most people are just interested in the berries themselves. So if you want to know more about the other herbal benefits, definitely look it up and do more research on that. On my channel I talk most about tonic herbs, so I'm not going to get too heavily into the other more acute type issues that it can be good for. Another thing actually that just comes to mind that the inner bark's good for is snow blindness, is what it was used for, making a decoction of the inner bark. So I guess that's more a little bit of survival knowledge, and if we're also going to talk about survival knowledge, the young shoots or stems of the plant are really good for making rope, and they could even be formed into whatever shape you need and then fire hardened over a fire, and it'll hold whatever shape you put it into, which is also quite useful in a traditional sort of survivalist or wildcrafting type knowledge. It was also used for making baskets. So you can imagine if you have a lot of these strands and you make a basket, it might be a little bit floppy or flimsy, but then you can fire harden that basket and it becomes quite firm. And that can be useful for collecting other things if you want a handmade sort of container that you would use to collect other types of wild foods. So we're going to turn around and get some close-up shots of the leaves and other identifying parts of the plant, and I'll show you the berries as well so that you can locate this in your own area. So like I said, this is actually a massive tree in comparison to what I've seen in other examples, but that's about 2 stories tall, I guess, at the top there. And if we get in closer, you can see what the actual berries look like. I'll have to focus in on here. So they're very sort of a deep red color. That's the first obvious thing we can see. And the ripe ones are essentially just these ones that get darker. Here's a really good one. And they come right off when they're perfectly ripe. So one identifying factor obviously is the crown, which is sort of the leftover part of a blossom that you can see on the berries. And this is something on some berries that means a berry is edible. There are no non-edible berries that don't have this crown. So that doesn't mean that only berries that have a crown are edible, but it means that if you see a crown on a berry, it's edible, no matter what species it is. It's very similar to blueberry if you think of the crown on a blueberry, but the species aren't related in that sense, at least that immediately in the family tree or whatever. But the serviceberry has it, and that's one major identifying factor. Other species of the serviceberry will have darker berries when they actually get ripe. So if you see almost like a purplish blue color on a tree amongst red ones, that would mean that that specific species, when it gets ripe and ready to pick, that would be the color you'd want to look for. In this particular one, it's just a deep sort of blood red, scarlet red. And obviously you can see the leaf shape right there. It's very plain and easy to see. It's, you know, sort of your average almond shape. No huge identifying factors. It's slightly serrated, but not a huge amount. Some species will have a slight fuzzy underside, but this one doesn't. It's got a sort of glossy surface on the top side of this leaf on this particular subspecies. So once again, if you think you have one in your area or on your property, you'd want to really identify it and figure out which subspecies you have to make sure that it's the right one. And something I meant to say with the thing about the crown is don't just eat berries just because they have a crown. That should just be an indicator that you can eat it, and then you'd want to identify it first, because of course you don't want to eat anything from the wild that you haven't first properly identified. So once again, you can see there's some amazing ripe ones here. I'm going to collect a bunch and then show you what a bunch of them looks like, I guess. And just enjoy them. They're delicious. Can be eaten raw on their own. No grand amount of preparation needed. But of course, they'd be great in a mead, added to any kind of recipe you can think that any type of berry would be added to. You can dry them to preserve them. The indigenous Americans would preserve large quantities to last them the whole year in large cakes. And again, they'd process them with cooking, but that's not necessary. But for longer term storage, that might be a good idea. And it's quite popular as an ornamental just because it is so lovely and beautiful when it has all these big bunches of ripening scarlet colored berries. So here's another one. This is actually over at my parents' place. They have one just on the verge of their driveway. And as you can see, it's nowhere near as tall. It comes up about to my nipple level, so maybe that's a meter and a little bit. And it has a lot fewer berries on it because birds have ravaged it. It might have already reached its prime in terms of the ripeness of the berries, but there's a few left. There's a little one here, as you can see. And I have a feeling this is actually the same subspecies because the bark, which I didn't talk too much about, is smooth. And on the other tree it was a smooth bark serviceberry for sure. So perhaps one day this one will be just as tall. It's got plenty of sun here. But this is obviously a much younger, almost like shrub-sized example of the bush. The leaves are kind of the same as the other one. There's not a whole lot more to talk about it, but I'll show an example of the berries I collected, just so you can see that it's pretty easy to collect a large amount of them. That took me about 10 minutes to get that many. And I'll just show a few little other pictures from this Wild Berries of Ontario book, which is a nice little guide. You can see the author there if you want to check it out. So this just gives you some other ideas of what it might look like if you have a different species in your area. There's actually not that many pictures for serviceberry, but yeah, it's very useful. There's a few little recipes in there. It's a good little guide of all sorts of berries. You've seen me actually show pictures of it in past wild foraging berry videos, the blueberry one and the wild cranberry one, which I'll actually link on the screen if you want to check those out. Another sort of theory I have, just from reading about something in the seeds, they have a larger seed than most berries. They're edible. I've eaten them, and you just chew up the seed. It's not a hard seed. It's like very soft, but it's noticeable that there's a seed in there, or a few seeds. And they contain cyanide, similar to apricot kernels or almonds, like small amounts. And this has health benefits, but you might feel nauseous if you eat a large amount and try to consume them. So it is actually possible to eat them and spit the seeds out as well. There's controversy obviously around amygdalin, which is the cyanide-like compound. Contains cyanide, and it's actually said to have anti-tumor effects. But that's interesting because there's not usually a ton of berries with that in it, at least edible tiny berries. Obviously cherries and things like that, the larger pitted type berries are known to have that, but this obviously has enough of it that there's sometimes a warning depending on your source that you're looking at. So just take that into account if you want to risk that controversy. Consume it. It's really not a controversy in my opinion. That has known health benefits in many herbal traditions. It's big in Chinese medicine, that anyone undergoing cancer type treatments takes the apricot kernel seeds, and it has that similar flavor when you chew in the seeds that you would notice from almonds and apricot kernels. It's a slight, it's hard to describe. It's the amygdalin flavor, which you might be familiar with if you have consumed those in any quantity. So it's actually the compound laetril, which has been known as vitamin B17. And yeah, you can always look that up if you want to read about the possible benefits or non-benefits of that. So I hope you enjoyed this little wild food foraging video. Let me know in the comments below if you've ever consumed serviceberries before, or offer any other comments in general about this video. So with that, I'll talk to you next time. Take care and embrace life without limits.